Have you ever scrolled Instagram and suddenly found yourself on the page of a brother who just announced he closed on a brand new house with a so-called halal mortgage? The marble countertops, the two-car garage, the proud caption about how he kept it riba-free. And here's the thing that really gets me. The person doing this often makes less money than you do, just paid the down payment by emptying his Hajj fund, and is somehow signing up for a 30-year payment that will outlast his current marriage in roughly 70% of cases. So what's actually going on here? How are regular Muslims somehow affording these enormous halal home payments that seem to defy basic mathematics, while still telling themselves the rapper makes the math irrelevant? My name is Omar, and I spend way too much time thinking about money, halal finance, and why so many practicing Muslims sign up for products they haven't actually computed because they think the label has done the computing for them. If you've ever wondered how your cousin can afford that $650,000 colonial while complaining that grocery prices have doubled, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if it helps explain this modern money mystery. Now, before we dive into the mechanics of how people are pulling this off, let me paint you a picture of what we're actually dealing with here. The median existing home price in the US right now is around $418,000, and conventional 30-year mortgage rates are sitting near 6.5%. Halal mortgage providers like Guidance Residential, UIF, and La Riba use Diminishing Musharaka, Murabaha, or Ijara structures, and the all-in monthly payment on a halal product is typically very close to the conventional rate, sometimes within a tenth of a point, sometimes a touch higher. So we're talking about US Muslim households signing up for monthly housing payments that exceed what many of their parents paid for an entire house in the 90s. And yet somehow thousands of US Muslims are signing on the dotted line every single month, driving home from a closing that took 6 hours and using a profit rate they didn't fully read because the brochure said the magic word. But here's where it gets really interesting. Most of these people aren't secretly wealthy. They're not the kids of Dr. Uncles or trust fund holders. They're software engineers, pharmacists, small business owners, teachers at Islamic schools, and W-2 professionals. Regular practicing brothers and sisters who somehow found a way to make the numbers work, or at least they think they did. The truth is, there's a whole system designed to make these enormous payments feel acceptable specifically to a Muslim audience. And understanding how it works isn't about questioning halal mortgage providers or issuing rulings. That's not my lane. It's about protecting yourself from making a financial decision that could derail your family for the next 30 years just because you assumed the label closed the case. Let's start with the most obvious question. How much are we actually talking about here? On a $500,000 home with 20% down at a halal equivalent profit rate of about 6.6%, your monthly principal and rent component runs roughly $2,550 a month before property taxes, insurance, HOA, and the LLC maintenance fee guidance charges every month for the co-ownership structure, which currently runs $18.75 to $25 a month per their rate sheet. Add it all up and you're realistically looking at $3,200 to $3,500 a month for a regular family home in a regular Muslim-friendly suburb. Over 30 years, that's well over $1 million of total cost on a house that started at $500,000. Now you might be thinking, well Omar, maybe Muslim incomes have caught up. And if that's what you're thinking, I hate to be the bearer of bad news. According to the ISPU American Muslim Poll 2025, 37% of US Muslim households earn under $30,000 a year, compared with 26% of the general public. Even in the upper income bands, our community is income bimodal, not uniformly wealthy. So how are people actually doing it? The answer lies in a combination of factors that have changed how Muslim families approach home buying, and almost none of them are good news for the people signing those contracts. First, let's talk about term inflation. Halal mortgages in this country, in their most popular form, are 30-year products. The most promoted Diminishing Musharaka contracts run 30 years just like conventional. Some providers also offer 15 and 20-year options, but most buyers default to 30 because the monthly number looks reasonable. The appeal is obvious. If you spread a $500,000 home payment over 30 years, the monthly payment drops to something that feels survivable. That same home over 15 years might require $4,400 a month, and on a 30-year it's $3,200. The 30 looks reasonable. That's exactly what the buyer focuses on. But here's what most people don't think about when they're sitting at the closing table. By extending the term, they're not just lowering the monthly, they're dramatically increasing the total amount they will pay. That $3,200 monthly over 30 years adds up to over $1 million compared to roughly $790,000 if they had taken the 15-year contract. That is hundreds of thousands of dollars of extra cost just for the privilege of having a smaller monthly number. And during the early years of the 30-year term, almost all of your payment is rent rent on the financier's share of the home, which means your equity is growing at a glacial pace. You're functionally renting from a halal provider for the first decade. But extended terms are just the beginning. The second major factor is what I'll call the riba-free marketing trap. Walk into any Islamic finance seminar and you'll see brochures that emphasize the words riba-free, AAOIFI certified, scholar approved. Those words are doing a lot of work and most buyers stop reading right there. Here's the thing about a halal mortgage that providers will absolutely confirm if you ask, but most buyers never ask. Your profit rate looks almost identical to an interest rate. Many critics, including voices on Islamic finance guru and Sheikh Haitham al-Haddad, have argued that the form over substance distinction in some diminishing musharaka and murabaha contracts is so thin that the contract behaves economically the same as a conventional mortgage. On the other side, Mufti Taqi Usmani, one of the architects of the modern AAOIFI standards used in the US, has supported these structures under the conditions of necessity for Muslims living in non-Muslim countries. The Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America gathered 230 imams in Dallas in 2014 specifically to review the contracts of US Islamic finance companies, and the resulting positions ranged from cautious approval to clear concern. Scholars will never all agree on this because it's an issue of ijtihad. None of that is for me to settle. What is for you to settle is whether the rapper has made you stop doing the math, because if you signed a 30-year contract telling yourself the rapper makes it irrelevant whether you can actually afford it, you've fallen into the trap regardless of where you land on the underlying ruling. Then there's the equity game, which has become increasingly relevant as housing markets wobble. Here's how it typically works. A brother buys a $500,000 home with a halal product. After 3 years, his ownership share has crawled up by maybe 5%. The housing market in his city softens. The home is now worth $470,000. He still owes the financier on roughly $370,000 of co-ownership. He's effectively underwater on a diminishing musharaka contract. So what does he do? He can't easily walk away because depending on the structure, he's contractually committed to keep buying out the financier's share. Some halal contracts specifically lock both parties into the original co-ownership agreement, which sounds protective until you realize it can also trap you when the market turns. People assume that because there's no traditional mortgage, there's no underwater scenario. There absolutely can be, and the structures vary enough that you should not assume your specific contract behaves the way the brochure described. But perhaps the most concerning trend is how normalized these enormous halal mortgage payments have become inside our community. People who would never dream of spending $3,000 a month on anything else somehow convince themselves it's reasonable for housing because they're using a halal provider. Think about it this way. If a brother told you he was spending $3,000 a month on date imports, you'd politely suggest he see somebody. If he said he was dropping that on Eid clothes, you'd assume something was very wrong. But somehow when it's a halal home payment, we just nod and say, well, he needs to provide for his family. Alhamdulillah, he kept it halal. This normalization didn't happen by accident. Decades of marketing and frankly decades of khutbahs have convinced Muslims that homeownership is the only legitimate finish line. Your house isn't just shelter, it's a statement that you've made it. It signals stability for marriage proposals, for the auntie network, and for your kids' school admissions. The halal finance industry has become incredibly sophisticated at tapping into these psychological triggers. They don't sell financial products anymore. They sell the dream of being the brother who finally bought a real home without compromising his deen. That sales process makes it much easier for people to justify payments that would otherwise look completely irrational on a spreadsheet. When you're not just buying a house, but buying into the identity of the brother who finally did it the right way, suddenly that $3,200 monthly feels like an investment in your iman rather than what it actually is, which is a 30-year commitment to a profit rate you mostly didn't read. But let's get back to the practical mechanics, because even with extended terms and identity manipulation, $3,200 to $3,500 a month is a lot of money for most Muslim households. This is where things get really creative, and by creative I mean potentially disastrous. Many people are essentially restructuring their entire financial lives around their halal mortgage payment. They're treating it like the only line item in the budget that matters and adjusting everything else accordingly. I've seen brothers move their kids out of full-time Islamic school into Sunday-only programs because they can't afford both the tuition and the mortgage. I've seen families move in with parents indefinitely, not as a sunnah-aligned multi-generational choice, but because they cannot otherwise sustain the monthly. They will eat plain rice and lentils for lunch every day while While paying for a marble counter kitchen, they can't afford to actually cook expensive halal cuts in. They will skip Umrah trips, avoid weddings, and put off other major obligations, all to support a halal mortgage payment that consumes 35 to 40% of their take-home income. Some are taking on side jobs specifically to cover the mortgage. They will drive Uber on weekends in the very car that's parked in the new garage, generating just enough to cover the difference between budget and reality. Others are dipping into retirement accounts, or worse, into Hajj funds and zakat reserves to cover down payments or unexpected costs. Borrowing from your future Hajj or your zakat obligation to fund your current housing fantasy is one of the worst trades a Muslim can make in this market. Then there's the credit card shuffle that's become more common than people want to admit. Brothers will put property taxes, repairs, even closing cost shortfalls on credit cards to keep the halal mortgage payment intact. They are essentially using straight-up riba-bearing credit to subsidize a contract whose entire selling point was that it was riba-free. That contradiction is the trap. The wrapper on the mortgage doesn't sanctify the credit card carrying the property tax bill it just created. But here's where the story gets even more interesting. Many of these families aren't just absorbing one halal product, they're stacking. The household has the halal mortgage. They also took out halal car finance from a separate provider because they wanted to keep the car halal too. They refinanced student loans through a Sharia compliant program. 3 contracts, 3 monthly payments, 3 sets of fine print they didn't read because each one had a scholar's name on the brochure. When you stack 3 halal financing products on a $90,000 household income, you have built yourself a Sharia flavored debt portfolio that behaves financially like any other over-leveraged household. The auntie network sees a brother who did everything right. The income statement sees a household one layoff away from a far-aid distribution conversation. And then there's the side ledger that most people completely ignore when they're computing affordability. Property taxes, HOA fees, homeowner insurance, where you'll need to navigate which carriers your scholar of choice would prefer for the underlying contract, maintenance. The 1% rule from financial planning suggests setting aside 1% of the home's value every year for maintenance, which on a $500,000 home is $5,000 a year, or about $416 a month that almost nobody factors in. For a Muslim family with a $500,000 home, the all-in monthly cost of ownership, including taxes, insurance, HOA, and a real maintenance reserve, will be closer to $4,000 a month than the $3,200 number on the contract. That extra $800 doesn't show up at closing. It shows up Tuesday after Tuesday when you check your bank account and wonder where the money went. But here's where the math gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean genuinely brutal. Let's run the real numbers most people never bother to compute. Imagine a brother buys a $500,000 home with 20% down using a 30-year diminishing Musharaka contract at an effective profit rate of 6.6%. His all-in monthly is roughly $3,200 once you include taxes and insurance. Over 30 years, the total payments will be in the neighborhood of $1.15 million. He'll have built equity in a home that may or may not be worth more than $500,000 in real inflation-adjusted terms by the time he's done. The opportunity cost is what really stings. If he had instead rented a comparable place for $2,200 a month, paid zakat on his savings, and invested the spread, the difference between rent and the halal mortgage all in, into a Sharia-screened equity portfolio, earning 8% annually over 30 years, that monthly $1,000 difference compounds into well over $1.4 million. Net of the inflation effect on the rent, the renting and investing strategy can rival or beat the homeowner outcome over 30 years, especially in expensive metro areas. None of this is a recommendation. The scholarly views on whether renting permanently is preferable to a halal mortgage genuinely differ, and IFG, Joe Bradford, and AMJA have all written useful frames you should read before making your call. But the math is the math, and most US Muslims who buy never run it because they assume the label did the running for them.
Then there's the psychological trap that makes this cycle so hard to break. Once a brother commits to a halal mortgage, he develops what I'll call halal Stockholm syndrome. He becomes emotionally attached to the contract because it represents identity, sacrifice, and the years he waited to do this the right way. The home isn't just shelter anymore. It's a reflection of his deen, his discipline, and his standing. The idea of selling and renting feels like admitting failure or going backwards in front of the auntie network. This emotional attachment makes rational financial analysis nearly impossible. When somebody points out the math, they don't hear analysis. They hear an attack on the most visible halal decision they've made in a decade. The Islamic finance industry understands this psychology and markets accordingly. easy. Walk into a guidance or UIF seminar at the local convention and you'll notice they don't spend much time on total lifetime cost or opportunity cost of capital versus a screened ETF. They focus on monthly payment, scholar names, and the framing of the alternative as conventional riba. The sales process has been refined to overcome every rational objection a buyer might raise. Worried about the 30-year length? Here's a 20-year option. Concerned about whether the contract really differs from conventional? Here's an AAOIFI certificate. Worried you can't actually afford this? Well, the financier already pre-approved you, so somebody must think you can. So there you have it. The mystery of how Muslim families are affording these enormous halal mortgage payments isn't really a mystery at all. It's a carefully oriented system of extended contract terms, identity-driven marketing, and financial gymnastics that the brochure never asks you to perform. People aren't actually affording these payments in any meaningful sense. They're kicking the can down a 30-year road while convincing themselves the wrapper has done the math for them. The next time you see a brother proudly post the closing photo of a house that costs more than your whole street, remember he's likely eating plain rice for lunch this week to make the next payment. As always, the math is the math, the scholarly views are the scholarly views, and your final ruling on murabaha versus diminishing musharaka versus renting forever has to come from a scholar you trust who knows your specific situation. Maybe, just maybe, that 2-bedroom apartment you're renting while quietly building a real halal portfolio isn't looking so bad after all.